All right, Chevra, here we go. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yoma Daf Tez Zayin. We left off pointing out the stira, the contradiction that we find regarding exactly where was the Lishkas Hataloim, where was the chamber in which they stored the lambs for the Talmud. As we explained, they needed to have there at least 6 unblemished lambs, because we needed to have a system where 4 days prior to the Talmud being brought, every day for 4 days in a row, these lambs were pre-inspected. And the question is that in Masechta Talmud, the Mishnah writes that that chamber was in the northern western subchamber in the Beis HaMoikat. The northern western chamber was in the non-sacred part of the chamber, in the choil part of the chamber. In Masechta Midos, we have that chamber, we have the Lishkas Hataloyim placed in the southern western corner of the subchamber in the Beis HaMoikat, which is in the Kodesh part of the Beis HaMoikat. So exactly where was it? So the solution the Gemara offered, that's where we left off yesterday, was very similar to the solution we had for the stira we had between other Mishnayos that perhaps we mentioned before, that generally there are rules that when you have a Mishnah that's written stam, that's written anonymously, we say that that's authored or that's following the Tana of Rabbi Meir, which is the same thing, almost always the same thing as saying this follows the Tana of Rabbi Akiva. Stam Rabbi Meir, Meir was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. However, here we're saying that the entire Masechta Midos, whenever the Mishnah writes a din stam, it's authored by the Tana Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That is what we left off yesterday. In other words, indeed, it's a machlokes Tanoim, and a Masechta Midos, we're following Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And today we're going to actually succeed in proving that Masechta Midos is authored by the Tana Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now it's going to be a very unusual, fascinating daf. We're going to be studying about the sanctified part of Temple Mount. It's not that the whole Temple Mount, it's not that the whole Harabayis had Kedushas Harabayis or had the Kedusha of Machna Leviah. There was a large area of the Harabayis, 500 by 500 amas, that was sectioned off with the wall. One of those walls are standing today, and that is what we refer to as the Koisel Hama'aravi. That's the western wall surrounding the Harabayis. So there were 3 other walls, and the area inside of it was what we call the Harabayis. Now the Harabayis is a mountain. On the Harabayis, not exactly in middle of Kedushas Harabayis. There's actually a big machlokes exactly where on the Harabayis is the Beis HaMikdash built. Will the Beis HaMikdash be rebuilt? God willing, imminently. But the Beis HaMikdash itself, which was built on a slope, was not sloped. When we walk in the Ezras Nashim and then into the Ezras Anashim and those who were able to enter the Ezras Kahanim, we're not walking on an incline. The Beis HaMikdash was actually graded, if that's the right word, or it was terraced, if that's the right word, which means that they made certain areas flat. And then every now and then, when we walked from one area to the next, we needed to walk up steps. And we're going to go into the details right now as it's written in Masechta Midas. We're going to be chazering many Mishnayos and Midas. Now listen to this. There's one nakuda here. In the very rare occasions, as we also spoke about this on the Beis, where we needed to burn a new red heifer, a new paraduma, and the avodah, the shchita, and the burning was dafka done chutz of Yerushalayim on Har Hazesim, or as it's called in the Mishnah, on Har HaMishcha. But it wasn't done in any place on Mount Olives. It needed to be done in a location where the kohen was, number one, facing the heichal, and more importantly, listen to this detail, he needed, while he sprinkled the dam of the slaughtered para aduma towards the heichal, the kohen needed to look inside the heichal. The challenge is that there are many gates and doors that lead. Don't forget, Har HaMishcha is towards the east of the Yerushalayim. In other words, the kohen is facing west. So as he's looking inside the Heichel, his eyesight has to go through the eastern part of the Makom HaMikdash more towards the west until he can see into the gateway, into the entrance of the Heichel. Now, there were many doors, there were many gates. Why did it not obstruct his vision? And indeed, it could have. And because of that, as we will learn, they built the eastern wall around Harabayas, not the gateway. The gateway all had the same size. It was 20 amos tall and 10 amos wide. But normally when you have a gateway, on top of the opening, there is a wall. And the walls were built very tall. But we're going to learn a Mishnah that the eastern wall, the opposite side of the Koisel Hamaravi, the Koisel Hamizrachi, the wall itself, right above the gateway, was very short. Because if it would have been built tall, then the Kohen would be unable to see into the Heichal. Now, we're going to go through the cheshbonos of how tall was the floor of the Heichal vis-a-vis the floor of the Harabayas. And we will see that this statement, that they needed to make sure that the walls are short, is only according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, which will be the raya, which will be the final raya, that Midos was authored by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Because if we're not going to follow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, then as long as the doorway, the gateway of the Koisel HaMizrachi would have been left open, and why would it not be left open? Then the Kohen on the Hara Mishcha would not have to look over the wall. He would actually be able to look inside the gateway. The gateway, the top of the gateway of Shara Mizrachi was 20 amos off the ground. According to the Chachamim, the ground level of the Heichel was 19 and a half amos taller than the ground of the Harabayas upon which the wall was built, which means that you can see from the top half a amma, from inside the gateway, you can see into the floor of the Heichel. And therefore, indeed, l'chachamim, we would have built the walls above the gateway of Shar HaMizrachi just as tall as all the other walls. Why not? Everything should be consistent. But only according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that will hold, as we will see, that the floor of the Heichel was 20 and a half amas higher than the bottom of the Koisel HaMizrachi of Temple Mount. In other words, you can't see the floor by looking through the gateway. You can only see it when you look over the wall. Indeed, that's why the wall was built relative to the others very short. The gateway was all the same. The gateway was 20 amas tall. But whatever was above it, there was a lintel, and that was it. There wasn't a large masonry built above it. That will also lead us today into another very important machlokes as to where exactly was the Mizbeach placed in the area in the Azara. We're speaking about the outer altar. And as we will see, we really have a three-way machlokes Tanoim. We'll have three opinions. The third opinion is not explicitly alluded to today, but we'll speak it out at the end of the daf. And then we'll suggest perhaps an inner meaning behind this machlokes of where the outer altar is placed. It's going to be a very fascinating geographical daf. And Hilchos Ela Mashiach, Toidas Geula Mashiach, that's going to be today Yoma, daf Tezayin, all about the Beis HaMikdash. So Chevra, we're going to start 6 lines from the top of the Amid by the Tanan. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'ar kol dvarim. The stira that we're coming here to resolve again is that in Masechtas Tamid, the Lishkas HaToloim, there it says, was in the northwestern top left, we'll call that, in the Choil. In Masechta Midos, the Lishkas HaToloim was on the same side, it was in the west, but it was in the southern western corner, which happens to be Kodesh. Where was it? So we answered Machlokes, and Midos, which says it wasn't Kodesh, that says it wasn't the southern western corner. That Mishnah, like all the other Stam Mishnayos in Midos, is following Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So that's the whole goal of the whole daf, is to prove that statements that are made in Midos are statements that only follow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Really, we're going to have 2 proofs. We'll explain. We'll quote the Ritva that says, why does the Gemara have to bring 2 proofs? The first proof is very simple. And let us start. Ditnan. This is a Mishnah in Midos. Ezras Nashim. Let me just speak out again. When you went into the Beis HaMikdash, most people would enter from east to west. Whenever we speak about measurements or the length and the width, also to be aware, what's the length and what's the width? Length in the Beis HaMikdash area was from east to west or from west to east. It was taka much longer, but that's the way people entered. And the width is the north-south, south-north dimension. So it says the Mishnah, Ezras Nashim, the length of the Ezras Nashim from east to west was Meyo Ushloishim V'chamesh, was 135 ames. Al Roichav, and the width north-south was exactly the same. Meyo Ushloishim V'chamesh, 135 by 135. Ezras Nashim was a square, was a cube. Ezras Nashim, it's very important to know this, did not have the real kedusha of the Azara. Ezras Nashim Midoi Raisa had the same kedusha of Harabayis, which is also very holy. It has the kedusha of Machna Leviyah. I like the picture, great. And just like we learned the detail of the Beis HaMoikad yesterday, now the Beis HaMoikad is further west than the Ezras Nashim. Part of the Beis HaMoikad is taka in the real Azara. It's further west. And just like we learned yesterday that the Beis HaMoikad had in its four corners 4 sub-chambers, similarly, in a much larger scale, says the Mishnah, that in each one of the corners of Ezras Nashim, there was a large chamber. And here again, the Mishnah is explaining, so we'll go through the Seder. Droimis Mizrachis, what we are calling, again, continuing from yesterday, if we're going to put the north in the front, because we're facing the Mizbeach, even though here we're not talking about the Mizbeach at all. So Droimis Mizrachis is going to be the bottom right corner, right? The eastern, southern corner. That was called the chamber of, that's very good. In the picture exactly in the bottom right, that was the Lishkas HaNazirim. Why was it called the chamber of the Nazirim? Shasham Nazirim of Ashlam Eshlemeim, after the Nazir finished his or her days of Nazirus vow. So they had to bring 3 karbanos. One of them was a carbon shlamim. And there was something unique about the shlamim, what the Torah refers to in Parshas Nasi, the zroya b'sheila. It's not neged the ditam right now, but a part of it needed to be cooked. And not only did a part of it need to be cooked, but the hair of the nazir that now was cut off, the hair of the head, needed to be burnt under the pot. And we'll learn pratim in Masechtas Nazir, even though the Torah speaks about it being burnt under the pot of the shlamim. If it was burnt under the other pot of the chatas, even though the chatas is eaten only by the kahanim, it also would be good. But anyways, umegalchen so'adam, that is where they would shave their hair. And umeshalchen tachas adud, they would place or throw the hair under the cauldron, under the large dud pot that would be cooking the zroya b'sheila. And because of that avoida, the whole chamber beared its name, Lishkas HaNazirim, Mizrachis, Sephinis, and now we are going up. Mamish, like we learned yesterday, we're going counterclockwise. So we began bottom right, now we're going to the top right corner, but this is in the Ezras Nashim, right? The northern eastern corner. That was called Hi Hoisa Lishkas Dir Ha'etzim. That was the chamber where they would store the wood. And if you remember, right, this whole Gavaldic topic that we had in Shkolim as to one sheet of where the entrance to the secret pathway through which they went to hide the Aron HaKodesh, that was in this chamber. Remember that? That was like the 14th place where people needed to bow down, for those of us who learned Shkolim. And what happened in this storage chamber? It wasn't only that the wood was stored, but furthermore, Shesham Kohanim, that are Bali Mumin and therefore not qualified to do the Avodah proper, but they were allowed to stand there, Umasliam Be'etzim, and they would make sure that there are no worms in the unique logs that eventually we'll put on the Mizbeach. So they would what we call deworm it. Shakol Eichi, Yesh Boy Toilas, Pasal Gabe Mizbeach. We have a few details of the Avodah. Chamber number 3, now we're going, again, we're turning counterclockwise. So we're walking now, so to say, on the northern section of the Ezras Nashim, and we're going now towards the left, we're going towards the west. So we're going to hit now Tzfoinis Marav, is the top left, and that's called Lishkas HaMitzoraim. Why is it called Lishkas HaMitzoraim? It's interesting just to understand why the Mishnah didn't explain, as it did in the others, but B'kitzur, the Mitzora, on the 8th day, after a lengthy procedure, mamash at the end, the Mitzora would also bring 3 karbanos. Yeah, whether he's wealthy or poor, that would determine the oil and the chatas, whether it's animal or bird. But regardless, the Mitzora would always have to bring an animal asham, because we needed to have that blood that would be applied to the center, to the cartilage of the right ear of the Mitzora, and then to the right thumb, and then to the big toe of the right foot, with all of the pratim that the Mitzora was like stuck in a catch-22. On one hand, the blood right, that has kedushas kachim may not be taken out from the azara. On the other hand, the mitzoida may not even enter the azara before he went through the entire kapara. So that was the compromise, that they were not mekadesh, the gateway of the Niknar gate. And as you can notice, if you saw the picture, he's very near the Niknar gate, relatively near the Niknar, because he's already on the western side of the Ezras Nashim. The Niknar gate is what separated the Ezras Nashim to the Ezras Anoshim. The Niknar gate is the area from when you went, like I mentioned, biblically, the Ezras Nashim only had Kedushas Harabayas. Where did the real Kedushas Hazara begin? By Ezras Anoshim. So the Mitzoida used to stand there and he would only put his ear in, be a b'mitzvah, slav shmabiyah, that whole topic, which is not, again, the Mishnah doesn't even touch it. But that was called the chamber of the Mitzoida. And by the way, there was a mikveh in there. Another detail, that even though the Mitzoida obviously needed to go to the mikveh on the seventh day, but here, right before the dam of the carbon asham and then the oil, remember the extra loik hashem would be applied to his body parts, he would again go to the mikveh. And the fourth chamber, says the Mishnah, ma'arav is the roimis, what we are calling now the bottom left, right, the southern western corner. So Amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, shachachti mahois, I forgot what was there. Now let me ask you a question. If the author of this Mishnah is not Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, it's anyone other than him, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and it's Stam Rav Meir, Stam any other Tana, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov doesn't know what was there, where would you find? Imagine, Rebbe's writing that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov didn't know what was there. Well, if he didn't know, so why don't you ask Rabbi Yossi? Obviously, Rabbi Yossi also didn't know, right? Rabbi Lazar also. So why are you quoting someone saying they don't know? You quote someone that knows. And indeed, Abu Shal knew. And we quote him. So the Mishnah should have written, Marav is the Raimis, Abu Shal Oimer, which is what he knew. And let's keep on reading, that Ba Hoyanoistim Yain V'Shemen. That was the chamber where they stored the wine and the oil, and they actually called it Lishkas Beish Sham Nayo, the Lishka of the oil. Interesting that they chose oil over wine for whatever reason. So what's the Raya that says Rashi? Muzman Zogan, the only way to explain it is Tam Mishnah Midas is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So it's him speaking. So if we're quoting him, he said, I don't remember. Which is why we needed an Abba Shol. If it would not be him speaking, then why would we say that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said, I forgot? Now this is really a raya. The only thing is that this is a Stam Mishnah that's not siding with the Machloikis. Because there isn't a Machloikis, and even if there is a Machloikis, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, I don't know. What we are looking for, a greater raya, is that if a Mishnah Stam Mishnah Midas makes a statement, and that statement is subject to a Machloikis, as we'll have soon regarding the height of the wall, of the eastern wall, and the Mishnah doesn't quote the Machloikis. The Mishnah doesn't say, Divrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov v'chachamim. It says Stam. That is Stam Mishnah's only Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this is not good enough of a proof. It's a proof that a Mishnah that's not speaking about a topic that is of a debate is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Yechap, but that's why the Ritva explains the Gemara wants to bring another raya. But this is a great proof. This Mishnah must have been authored by him. Now, even though it was authored by him, since the Mishnah does not quote his name, the Mishnah cannot say, let's like, Oimer ani shochachti. The Mishnah says, now we have to say, I forgot, and Abba Shol was the one that reminded us. But the beginning must have been him as well. But now, continues the Gemara, second to last narrow line, Hachinami mistabra. Like the Ritva adds, even when there is a Stam Mishnah Midrash that quotes a din without even quoting both sides, and it doesn't quote the author of this din, that will be Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. I'll prove it to you from another case. Hachanami mistabed Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, even by a machloikes ditnan gewaldig. And here we start. Ditnan kol aksalim shoy yesham hoye gavoim. All of the walls that surrounded the Beis Hamikdash, all of the walls that were inside the Beis Hamikdash, aside of the dimensions of the gateway, which means of the inner opening, and as we learned, aside of the ulam that was double of everything. Remember that, Chevra? Remember that was the beginning of Eruvin. The ulam was double as big. That was the whole height. But all of the other gateways were 20 tall, and 10 wide, and we're going to focus on the height now. There were 20 amas tall. But again, 20 amas tall is the door, the gateway. But on top of it, you don't only have a lintel. On top of it, you can have a large masonry whited building. So that's what the Mishnah is saying, that all of them were very tall. Not that the gateway was tall. The gateway was consistent. But the stones, the masonry, the wall, whatever it was made out of that was on top of the opening was very tall. Aside of the eastern wall. We're speaking here about the walls surrounding Harabayis, that it was purposefully left very short. There was an inconsistency, but there has to be a reason for that. And what's the reason? The kohen that is burning the paraduma. And as we mentioned, he is standing oimed bahar hamishcha. But as the Torah says that he sprinkles the dam keneged the heichal. Really, there are two details of that din. It's not only where his body should be faced. It's not only that he's sprinkling it towards the heichal. We understand from Sukkim that he also has to see inside the heichal. Now we have to figure out how that works. Umechuven, or let's see what the Bach says. Mistama umechaven. Umischaven veroya keneged pischoy shel heichal b'shas hazoas hadam. He must see into the heichal. And now, how does that answer? How does that answer? Just because he has to see into the heichal. So, like we mentioned, that the whole mountain became terraced. I think that's the better word. But as you go up, the floor becomes higher and higher. And therefore, as we'll see, this is a Stam Mishnah. The Mishnah that we just quoted doesn't say Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It says Stam. It says that the wall needed to be short to be able to see over it. The question will be, why do you have to look over it, since the gateway during the Shechitas HaPara would be opened? Then, as we'll prove, according to the opinions of the Chachamim, not Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, looking into the highest part of the gateway, the top half am of the gateway, that will allow the Kohen on Har HaMishcha to see at least into the ground of the Heichal. So the question now will be, how tall is the floor of the Heichal vis-a-vis the floor of the base of the Shar HaMizrachi, or Harabayis? You chap what's going on over here? Simple. That's the Nakoda. The doorway was 20 amas tall. If the floor of the Heichal was less than 20 amas, then you can see through the top of the gateway. It's only if the ground of the Heichal is above 20 amas, and that's only the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that will justify building the masonry over, or part of the top of Shar HaMizrachi very short, because you have to look over it. And now let's go. Vitnan, the end of the second wide line. And Vitnan. Now let's go through the height when you're walking into the Beis Hamikdash from the eastern entrance, which is the main way to enter. Let's understand what happened. So first, when you entered, there was a large area which had Kedushas Harabayis that went up into the first structure that you met was the Soireg. And by the way, going back to Shkolim, we mentioned the Soireg, the two opinions. Where did they bow down? Either it was, remember, the 13 Sha'arim, and then the other Shita says that the Chashmonaim, they breached the Soireg. The Soireg was a very short, beautiful wooden lattice fence. And that was placed before you would come to the Ezras Nashim. And we're going to have exactly measurements. Now, there's a whole debate. Why was it placed there? It's not negir right now. We know that from the Soireg until you entered, the next structure would be the Ezras Nashim. That area is called the Chayil. And Goyim were not allowed to walk beyond the Soireg. People that are Tamei Meis, and we learned that, imagine, a Tamei Meis is allowed to go on Harabayis. That was the whole irony. We had this in Psachim. Remember that a person who's Tamei B'Zera, you can't go on Harabayis. The lower Tumah. Tamei Meis can go on Harabayis. The proof was that Moshe Rabbeinu had the Atzmos Yosef. We're with him in Machna Leviah. Anyway, so a Tamei Meis can go until the Soireg. Biblically, a Tamei Meis can go until the Ezras Anoshim, because that is where biblically the Machna Shechina began. But the Chachamim said that if someone who's Tamei Meis cannot go beyond the Soidik. That's one of the reasons. Then they also built a Soidik to be allowed to carry. There's a whole to do, and I hope we spoke it out when we learned Midrash. You can find this online, Chabad.org, regarding the Soidik. So first you went into the Soidik. Now, Vitnan, Lifnimi Menu, now let's start speaking about the height. So when you went to the Soidik, from the Soidik until you would enter Ezra's Nashim, you would have a total going from east to west of 10 amas. But the 10 amas were not all straight. On the 10 amas, not on all of them, guys, on the last 6 of them, on the last 6 of the 10 amas, there were 12 steps. Now, Roy Maila, the height of each step, like we mentioned, everything was terraced. So when you walked into Shara Mizrahi, this is the first time you are starting to walk up. You walked up 12 steps. Well, how high did you reach? So the Mishnah writes that the height of every step was a half an amma. There you go. And Vishilcha.
What is an half an amma approximately today?
Well, if an amma is going to be 18 inches, let's go with that. Or a drop more, let's go to 9 inches. It's not. Let's just speak ammas. So guys, if you have 12 steps, and each step is a half an amma. So how high up did you go now? You went up 6 ammas. That means that the floor of the Ezra's Nashim, this is the first time we have a grading, is 6 ammas taller than the floor of Harabais. Now, how far did you go? So he says it went up a half an amma and Vishilcha, and it went in, right? The tread, that's the word, went in another half an amma. So that's another detail. That means that if the 12 steps took up going from east to west 6 amas, and there was only 10 amas from the Soidik to Ezra's Nashim, that means in the latter 6 amas you had the staircase, and the first 4 amas of the area of the Soidik was flat. But now what we know now is that the ground of the Ezra's Nashim is 6 amas higher than the ground of Harabais. Let's go weiter. Now you go from the Ezra's Nashim, which we mentioned is 135 amas. It's a nice piece of land. You went into the Ezra's Anashim, and Taka, you went through the Shad Miklar. But there was another staircase. V'tezvav mailas oilas mitoicha. There were now, you have 15 steps that go from the Ezra's Nashim into the Ezra's Anashim. Hayoridois me Ezra's Yisrael Ezra's Nashim. Okay, let's call it Ezra's Yisrael. So guys, again, the height of the steps were the same, which is Roy Mailach. Roy Mailach, the height of every step was a half an amma. And Vishilcha Chatzi Amma. So Rabbi Chaim is here to help with the math. So we have 7.5 ammas tall. 7.5 and 6, 13.5 ammas. In other words, Atkan, the floor of the real Azara, right? What we're calling here Ezra's Yisrael, the floor was 13.5 ammas higher than the floor of the Harabayas. We're not done yet. Now Vitnan. Now when you went again, it was graded. It was terraced. So when you're walking, as we'll see in Ahmed Beis, there was 11 ammas of Ezra's Yisrael. The next 11 ammas was Ezra's Kohanim. And that is until the Mizbeach. And then he says, between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, you have 22 ammas. We're going into the next staircase. And on these 22 ammas, towards the end of the 22 ammas, you have another 12 steps. What are we up to? That's another 6 ammas tall. Room Maila, again, the height of every step was a half an amma, and again, Vishilcha Chatzi amma. So where are we up to, my friends? So now if we were up to 13.5, and add the final staircase, which gives you another 6 ammas, that's 19.5 ammas. And now you are up to the height of the floor of the Ulam and the Heichal. In other words, the ground, the base of the Ulam and the Heichal, of the temple proper, was 19.5 ammas taller than the ground upon which the Koisel HaMizrachi was built. 19.5 ammas. So this is all building up to the question. Why did they have to shorten the masonry on top of the gateway? Leave the gateway open as it was opened. The gateway is 20 ammas tall. That means in the top half a amma of the gateway, if you would look, you have to have good vision, which the Kohen had. He would see into the Ulam. He would not see into the Ulam, into the Heichel. He would not see into the, into the height of it, but he would at least see into the ground of it, which is good enough.
Rabbi, I think it's 20 and a half amas, not 19 and a half.
No, you'll cheshbon.
Because you have a landing.
So I'll tell you, Shlomo, like this: 6. What we mentioned was 6, 7.5, and 6. That's what we had. The first staircase was 6. The next staircase was 7.5. That's 13.5. And
but
then
was a landing of 1 amma. And
not
then
yet,
was another
not
step.
yet. This is the chachamim. So all of this is really akasha. What's Danny shaking his head?
He's jumping to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov.
No, Beseder. Okay, make the cheshbon. However, now this will explain it. We know from another place that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is the only Tana that added another Amma, which would really answer our question. And the Tana Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, that Milo Hoysasham, in between Ezras Yisrael. Okay, let's stop calling it Ezras Anoshim. I'm sorry about that. In between Ezras Yisrael and Ezras Kohanim, 11 Amas, total of 22. But in between that, there was another step. And by the way, this step was not the usual half a amma, a Mishnah. He held it was 1 amma tall. Vigavoya amma, not with details, that the Duchan Nosen Olel, there was a platform leading up, there was a platform on it. Uboy, leading up to the platform, there were 3 extra steps, each one of a half a amma. Now, we're not even counting in this whole platform, but we're focusing now that the ground itself was 1 amma taller. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov was the one that added an amma. According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the floor of the ulam and the heichal, they were on the same level. They were 20.5 ammas above the floor of the harabayis, above the floor of the Kaisel Mizrahi. Now it works. So it's the Gemara, that's my second proof. And this is again a topic that is subject to a machlokes. That when there's a stam, an anonymous Mishnah in Masechta Midos, even though Rabbeinu HaKadosh didn't write who's the author of the opinion. But the rule is, like we are trying to say, and indeed it will stand, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now it makes sense. The first Mishnah that we learned right over here in the second in the last narrow line, the Mishnah that we quoted above. That what? That Hainu, the Ikasi lay Pischa, that the entire gateway, as we mentioned, is 20 amas tall. So if you're going to look through the gateway, you won't be able to see into even the ground, the lowest part of the Heichel and the Azara. So the only way to look inside it is to look above the wall. If you have to look above the wall, then you make sure that the height of the wall is substantially short. You have to have a lintel, but that's it. If the Stam Mishnah in Midos would be following the sheet of the Rabbanon, since Ha'ika Palga the Amsa, there is a half a amma from 19.5 to 20. The mischaze le pischa bigavei, that even if you don't look over the Shara Mizrahi, if you look inside through the gateway, the top half a amma will allow you to see inside the heichal. So why would they have to build the wall of the Shara Mizrahi short? Be consistent. So vaited elalav shmamina, that stam mishnayis in midos is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That's the second proof, even when there was a machlokes. Now we're going to have an attempted pushback, which will be refuted. And to appreciate the attempted pushback, let's now add another piece to the puzzle, which is gavaldik, that there is a mizbeach achitzoin. And now there's going to be a stamach klotz kasha. How can you see, according to the chachamim, into the floor when there is a mizbeach that's going to be blocking that? Now, will the Mizbeach be blocking that? Exactly where was the Mizbeach built? Now, like this, the height of the Mizbeach, we know, even if you're not counting the 4 horns, is 9 amas. So if you have the floor of the Ezras Kohanim, which is upon which the Mizbeach is, we were already 13.5 amas above the ground. 13.5 plus 9, yeah, that's it. So it's 22.5 amas above the ground. That means that if the Kohen cannot look over it to see the floor of the Heichel, that for sure cannot happen. The only question will be exactly when you're looking at the north-south dimension, where was the Mizbeach placed? Was there one side of the Mizbeach that was not mamish blocking the entrance to the Heichel? So says the Gemara, let's go. Maybe Rabbi Adda Barahava Omar Rabbi says that maybe Stam Mishnayos and Midos does not follow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It follows the Chachamim. Yes, you're right. If not for the Mizbeach, the floor of the Heichel is only 19 and a half amas. You would theoretically be able to look through the doorway. You don't have to look over it. But you know why you can't look through it? Because there is a Mizbeach blocking. Ein Bereda. Maybe Stam Mishnah in Midos follows the Tana of Rabbi Yehuda regarding where the Mizbeach was placed. And let's go. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the last line in the Amid, HaMizbeach, according to Rabbi Yehuda, was exactly Memutza v'Omer be'emtza Azorim. And we're going to get through many numbers soon. That when you're looking at the place of the Azorim, which is what we also will call now the Ezras Kohanim, if you're looking south to north, that's what we're saying. Just the Pnei HaMizbeach, from south to north, the Mizbeach was placed mamis in the center, which means like this. Rabbi Yehuda specifies. We know that the bottom of the Mizbeach, not the top, the bottom of the Mizbeach was 32 amas by 32 amas. Now, Chevra Be'emes, it's not Negea right here. It wasn't exactly 32 by 32 because since there wasn't a Yesoid entirely on the east, nor entirely on the south, so the Yesoid was 1 amma wide. But let's make believe there was a Yesoid. There were in those corners, there are corners, like we mentioned, even according to Shitas Rashi, in the northeastern corner, in the southwestern corner, there is an amma, at least an amma going into all of the directions, 32 by 32. Okay. The width, turning to Daf Tezayim. We're only focusing now on the width. Daf Tezayim on the base. Now, Eser Amois Keneged Pischei Shalechel. Rabbi Yehuda is describing how the Mizbeach was mamish placed in the center of. The 10 middle amas of the Mizbeach was facing exactly the opening of the Heichel. The opening of the Heichel was how wide? Not the Ulam, like we mentioned above. All of the doorways of the Beis HaMikdash, not only of the Temple Mount, but all of them aside of the Ulam was 10 amas wide. And Kohen has to look inside, not only the antechamber, he has to look inside the Heichel. So the door of the Heichel was 10 amas. It was mamish aligned to it. Now, if you gave the cheshbon of the 10 amas of the Mizbeach, how many amas do you have left if you have 32 amas? So now you have 22 amas left, but it was in the center. 11 of those 22 was towards the north, and 11 was towards the south. Yud Aleph Amal Tzafin, the Yud Aleph Amal Adarim. That's 22. And another interesting detail that if you were to, again, we learned all this in Midas, and God willing, we'll learn it again in Midas, that the walls of the Beis HaMikdash were very thick. Aside of the Heichal itself having an opening, which is Gavaldik of 10 amas, the walls, the thickness of the walls on each side, says the Mishnah, V'nimtza Mizbeach mechuven keneged Heichal v'koislav. Wow. And like Rashi writes, in other words, that there's 10, the walls are 6 amas thick. The walls are 6 amas thick on each side. And therefore, 6 and 6 has to 11. So his point is that it not only blocked the entrance to the Heichel, but it also, so to say, was blocking or was mechuven keneged the thickness of the walls. All's good and fine. The bottom line is that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the Mizbeach was placed in the center. And all of this is challenging the Raya that Stam Mishnah's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, as the Gemara explains. That the salka daitach. 1 second. So we'll stop over here. The Gemara doesn't have to explain it. It's self-understood. Maybe the Mishnah follows Rabbi Yehuda. The floor of the Heichel, my friends, is only 19 and a half amas above the ground of the Harabayis. The reason why they needed to build the wall short is because you are unable to see the floor through the doorway because the Mizbeach is blocking it. This is important. And again, the floor is going to be only 13 and a half amas. No, add the 9 amas of the height of the Mizbeach. Add the 9 amas. That's it. You can't see it. It's more than 20 amas. Counters the Gemara. No, I'm coming back to my proof. The Mishnah has to follow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Leave that picture up. I like that picture because it says the Gemara. It can be that Midos follows the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. Mizbeach be'emtza azara mi mishkachas lei. I'm going to show you another stam Mishnah in Midrash without an author that does not subscribe to the shita that we just quoted, that the Mizbeach was exactly in middle, when you're looking north-south, in middle of that area. It was not in the middle. It was a little bit more towards the south. Now, before we get into the numbers, guys, appreciate the simple thing. Yeah, Rabbi Chaim, that if the Mizbeach is enough towards the south, not centered, that when you are on Hara Mishcha, if you would look to the right side of the Mizbeach, some of that area is not blocked by the Mizbeach, then the Mizbeach is a non-issue. And therefore, we're back to the proof that indeed, we'll see Midrash doesn't hold Stam Mishnah, doesn't hold that the Mizbeach was in the center. The Mizbeach was more towards the south. If not for the issue of the height of the floor, according to the Chachamim, that the entrance to the Heichel, to the Ulam, to the Heichel was only 19 and a half amas above the height of Harabayis, then the Kohen that is sprinkling the Dam Pada will be able to look through the doorway. It has to be Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now we're going to show you a Mishnah that clearly states that the location of the Mizbeach was not in the center going from south to north. Vehatanan, a Mishnah in Midrash. Now we're going on, giving you the dimensions of the Azara proper. As we mentioned that the Ezras Nashim is not considered part of the Azara. Kol Azara beginning, guys, we're going now west, we're going east to west, length, east to west. We're beginning now with Ezras Yisrael. Right, we already spoke about the Ezras Nashim, 135 by 135. Now we'll go weiter. Kol Azara, and it went, the Azara went not only from the beginning of Ezras Yisrael, but it didn't end by the end of the building. As we'll see in a moment, that towards the west of the building itself, there was another 11 amas until you hit the western walls of the Azara, which is not the Koisel Amaravi. Koisel Amaravi is the western wall of Harabayas. But there was a western wall at the western side of the building proper, and in there we were still in the Kedusha of the Azara. That's what we're cheshboning. So Kol Azara Hoisa Oirach Meo Shmoinim V'Sheva was 187 amas long, east to west or west to east, but we're going to go from east to west. Al Roichav, and what was the width? South-north, north-south, it was 135. This was exactly the same as Ezras Nashim. And now the Mishnah is giving you the specifics. How do we get to the number 187? So let's begin. Where does it begin? Where does Ezras Yisrael begin in what we are calling Ezras Yisrael? How long, east to west, was Ezras Yisrael? Makam Dris Ragel Yisrael is Yud Aleph Amma. That goes into Ezras Kohanim. Now, this is irrelevant whether there was an Amma step or not. We're not even going, it's not Neger now. We're not going into the height now. We're only speaking about the length. The Ezras Yisrael went directly into the Ezras Kohanim. How long was the Ezras Kohanim? Mokaim Dris Ragel Yanim, Yud Aleph Amma. How many Ammas are we up to, my friends? 11 is 22. Now, what came right afterwards? We're looking at the length, east-west, Mizbeach, just like we spoke before. True, that north-south, 22 on the ground. Same thing, east-west. The length was also 32. So my friends, 32 and 22 is how much? I got Rabbi Chaim with me. I'm cheating. That's 54. Okay, let's go weiter. Bein Ulam HaMizbeach was another 22. How much is 54 and 22? Where are we up to, guys? 76. Okay. Now we are entering the building proper. Now the building proper, the Heichel itself, from one end to the other, from east to west, is 100. So now we are already covering the space of 176. And now, like I mentioned, when you would go to the other side of the building, right behind the wall behind the Kodesh Kachim, even though, like we just mentioned, the walls were thick, and remember the room called the Taf Aleph, there were little chambers inside the walls. All of that is part of the 100. The 100 goes from the building to the outside of the building on the western side. Now, when you come to the other side of the building, you're not on Harabayas. You have another 11 amas. Here we're calling the Kodesh HaKachim, the house that has the cover. Amazing. So that's the 187. Atkan Vaitim. Now we're going to go and specify the dimensions from north-south. Minadorim Litzafim, we're going from south. I take from south to north. All following, at least we're being consistent that we're placing the north in the front because we're facing the Mizbeach. The total was 135. Now, the way the Mishnah goes about it is very unusual, because if you're counting the numbers from south to north, there was an empty space going into the ramp. You would first tell you how much that space was. The Mishnah doesn't. The Mishnah begins from the ramp. We don't yet know how much ground space was there from the southernmost wall in the Azara until the ramp. We're going to extrapolate it soon. So the Mishnah begins. The Kevesh and the Mizbeach together were 62 amas. People jump. They say, no. The Mizbeach, we said, is 32. We also had, here in Yoma, we already read the Rashi, right? That the ramp itself was also 32. Once 32 and 32 is 64, not 62. The answer is that there was a 2 amma overlap, because the Kevesh, the ramp went over the Yesod, even though there was no physical Yesod, but it went over the area of the Yesod. Then when you go up the Mizbeach, as we learned in Shkolim, there were 2 times that the Mizbeach got narrower. First is above the first amma off the ground. The Yesod was 1 amma tall and 1 amma in. Then you had the Soivev, right? The ledge upon which Kahanim were able to walk around the Mizbeach. That's already, the Soivev was 6 ammas above the ground. But that also went in. So the Kevesh went over the Yesod, the Kevesh went over the Soivev. That's 2 ammas of overlap. So therefore, bottom line is that if you were to measure the floor from the beginning of the ramp, going from south to north until the end, the northernmost part of the Mizbeach, you would have 62 ammas. Now let's go weiter. They used to have slaughtering rings. How much space did you have in between it? Is 8 ammas. So 62 and 8, where are we up to? And let's go fight it. And the place of the rings themselves was 24. So 62 and 8 and 24 is 94. 94 ammas. From these slaughtering rings until the tables, how much do you have? You have another 4 ammas. So 94 and 4, my friend, is how much? 98. Now here, Rabbeinu HaKadosh keeps us on our toes. There is another 4 ammas that he does not mention. Why doesn't he not mention? Because as the commentators say, because that's a explicit verse, a befedish pasuk in Yecheskel, that the place of the Shulchanos themselves took up 4 ammas. So he doesn't even mention it. But we know, because you see, he doesn't speak about the Markim HaShulchanos. He only begins from the area of the Shulchanos further north. So really, we're up to 98, but we have to add 4 ammas. We're up to 102. Now, from the Shulchanos until the Nanasim, until the dwarf pillars, the midget pillars, was another 4. So 102 and 4 is 106. Here again, Rabbeinu HaKadosh doesn't mention how much space did these pillars take up, but we know it was 4. Okay. So where are we up to? We are up to 112. We are up to, 106. Let's keep the Makam Hananasim for a second. Let's keep that open. We're up to 106. Rabbeinu HaKadosh really only mentioned 102. We just added on our own the 4 ammas, which is the place of the Shulchanis. Now, min Hananasim l'koisel, until the other northernmost wall of the Azar is another 8. So where are we up to, my friends? 106 and 8. 106 and another 8 ammas.
114.
We are up to 114. Now go ahead and take the 135, which is the total with minus 114. What do we have? We have 21 ammas. 21 ammas that are unaccounted for. Where are we going to place the 21 ammas to the 2 things that Rebbe didn't mention? Really, again, Rebbe didn't mention the Makam HaShulchanos, but that's a given. It says clearly in Yecheskel 4 ammas. What Rebbe did not mention, remember the first step is from the southern wall until the ramp. He didn't mention. He didn't mention the place of those little dwarf pillars. So we're going to logically take the 21 and we're going to divide it into half. 11 and 11. But Hamoiser, the unspoken about 21.
Is it 10 and a half and 10 and a half?
I thank you, Danny. 10 and a half, 10 and a half. So I stand corrected. 10 and a half. Divided equal and equal. Okay. Now, if you put all that on your paper, we're going to go very simply. We're going to show over here the Stam Mishnah. If you're going to put the 135, now guys, 135 divided into half, it's very simple. what would be the exact center, the imaginary line that you would make that goes in between the north and the south? If the total area is 135, divided by 2 is 67.5. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the center of the Mizbeach should be on top of line 67.5 in the center. The cheshbon that we just give now does not place the Mizbeach or the center of the Mizbeach 67.5. It's not in the center. We go make the cheshbon. Says the Gemara, third to last line. The East al Kadaitoch, that Stam Mishnah would be Rabbi Yehuda, which would be another way of explaining why the top of the wall of the Shara Mizrachi needed to be short. Mizbeach be'emtza azora mi mishkachas. The cheshbon that we just made does not place it there. And guys, if you're going to look, if you're going to go now from north to south, you know where the Mizbeach begins? Make the cheshbon that we just mentioned. And that's again, that Danny, thank you for the 10.5. If you're going to give the 10.5 to the Makam Hanan Nasim, you will see that the northern part of the Mizbeach, that's not the wrong picture, the northern wall of the Mizbeach was how far away from the northern wall of the Azara, my friends? 62 amas and a half. Which means not 67.5, 62.5. You're going to see that it's 62 amas and a half. There is an additional 5 amas in the north that's open. There's an additional 5 amas in the north that's open. And now that's the picture that's over here on top. Not like Rabbi Yehuda that would place the Mizbeach further north, which would completely block the view of the kohen if the kohen is looking through the gateway. No, you have, and Rashi goes into the detailed cheshbon. Oh, let's just read inside the last line of the Gemara. Haruba the Mizbeach, the majority of the Mizbeach was bedarim. 5 amas off center, towards the south. 5 extra amas opened in the north. Now, really, like Rashi points out a couple of Gavalika details, that those 5 amas, don't forget that the kohen was not looking at the ground of the Mizbeach, and the ground of the Mizbeach was 32 by 32. As we just mentioned, once you start going up the Mizbeach, right, the ground of the Ezra's Kohanim was 13.5 amas above the Harabayas. When did the Mizbeach become skinnier again? When you went up the first amma, it went in from all sides an amma. Then when you went up a total 6 amas off the ground, that is where you had the soiviv. By the ledge, the Mizbeach went in another amma. Now, 6 amas, which is the height of the soiviv, 6 amas plus 13.5 amas is again 19.5 amas. Which means that that there's going to be, as Rashi cheshbons, 2 amas, the northernmost 2 amas of the Pesach of the Heichal did not have the Mizbeach obstructing it. Because the kohen would get into the angle, he would not be able to see into the center, but the kohen would be able to see. This picture that you have up makes it as if you can see through the center. He really can't, Rashi says. The real picture would be that the Mizbeach, if you take into account the Yisoid and the Soiviv, he would still be obstructed. But since we discounted, he would be able to see right over the Soiviv, inside the floor, if the Mishnah in Midrash would follow the sheet of the Chachamim, that the total of the floor of the Eichel was only 19.5 amas above the ground. And therefore, we're back to the proof. And what is the proof? Ella daf yud zayin, ella lav shma mino, that stam Mishnah Midrash is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov certainly does not subscribe to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Actually, based on what we learned, stam Mishnah in Midrash is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The numbers that we gave, like we mentioned, places the Mizbeach 62.5 amas away from the north, not 67.5. In other words, it places it towards this 5 amas more towards the south than towards the north. It's off center. Actually, what we need to know is that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, whose shita will be brought down on Daf Lamed Zayin, actually holds a third shita. And that third shita is that was the picture that someone put up before, that the entire Mizbeach, even the northernmost part of the Mizbeach, even the northernmost part of the Mizbeach was in the southern half of the area of the Azara. the northernmost part of the Mizbeach did not go beyond 67.5 amas from the southern wall of the Azara. Even more. So really there's three shitas. Rabbi Yehuda, that the Mizbeach was mamish in the center. We have the Stam Mishnah that we had here on Amud Beis, Tazayin Amud Beis, that places the Mizbeach 5 amas towards the south. 5 amas towards the south. We have really Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov that places the Mizbeach even more towards the south. None of the Mizbeach was in the tzafin of the Azara. Be that as it may, the only explanation why they needed to build the wall of the Shar HaMizrachi of Harabayis, the wall above the gateway, low, that's the picture according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, was only because the floor of the Azara, or the floor of the Heichal, and the Ulam floor of the Heichal was 20.5 amas above the ground. Stam Mishnah Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now, I would like to just give it a concept. I didn't read it anywhere. If it's not written, then it's stam an illusion. But to me, always, if you look at a picture of the Beis Hamikdash, it looks like the Tefillin Shel Rosh. It always gave that impression to me. I know it's on the side. Mamish looks like a pair of tefillin. And if you look at the picture that we had before with the not only the proper heichal, but on the side little chambers as we have in Midos. It's almost like the compartments of the parshiyos. Now, you look at the Mizbeach. Look at the Mizbeach with the ramp. To me, it looks like the Tefillin Shel Yad.
Rabbi,
let me just finish this concept. That if I'm right by saying that there's some sort of link between the Tefillin Shel Rosh and Tefillin Shel Yad with the building of the Heichel and the Ulam, and the Tefillin Shel Yad with the ramp, so this is a very meaningful machloikas about, are they centered or are they off-centered? Again, it looks like a pair of tefillin a little bit, like a box. And what's the whole avoid of tefillin? The whole avoid of tefillin is that we should center or we should align. That's what we have, the kavanah that we have to have. That we have to be meshabed, the lave to the mayach. That most of us, unless a person is a tzaddik, their heart is not aligned with their head. And maybe these shitas of how off-center was the tefillin shel yad signifies the koyach of tefillin. That even if you are completely off-centered, when you bind the tefillin, this empowers the person who's the farthest off to realign oneself and then to be meshabed, now the leif to the moyach, and the moyach has a much easier job to be meshabed itself to God Almighty. God willing to be continued. Yes,
Rabbi.
Yes.
Is the importance of the detail that you've just the importance of the detail that you just went through, because historically, or is it because the third temple, it's important to understand the specific detail that you just talked about?
Okay, so I would give you two answers. Well, let me first make a statement that the temples, all of them, were built by prophecy, and there were differences between the first and the second, as there will be with the third, and we will have to have a prophet confirming that we are building it correctly, or not confirming, the prophet will be the one giving direction. Learning about the second temple is very similar, Rav Baruch, to learning about all of the sacrifices with all of their details on so many different levels, beginning with that the mitzvahs are eternal. And therefore, even during the times that we cannot practice a mitzvah, literally, as we should always attempt to do, it doesn't mean since I can't do it, it's not connected to me. The second best thing of keeping a mitzvah is learning about it. And the reason why we were so careful in Mishnayos and in the oral Torah to write down the specific dimensions of it all is because Jews yearn for the temple. We want to be connected to the temple, and this is a way of really connecting to it. When you love something, you go through the details. We're not brushing it away, we're diving into it with all of the arguments. It's quite amazing. And indeed, Kol Halom, what did we learn? We learned about the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach brings about kapara. The Mizbeach brings about kapara, learning about where the temple was placed. That in itself has a gavaldik koyach, that Hashem should be mechaparas, God should wipe away our slate clean, and that will even furthermore hasten the coming of Mashiach. Amen.
Amen.